Good morning and a very warm welcome on the occasion of World Intellectual Property Day to this webinar organised by members of the biopharmaceutical industry on launching the IP PACT, our approach to intellectual property with patient and societal benefit at its core. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today, those watching via Zoom and those also joining us from YouTube. My name is Jacki Davis. I will have the privilege of moderating our discussions today, and we're going to have a totally interactive debate a little bit later on with questions, I hope, from me to our panel, but also from all of you. If you want to ask a question and you're on Zoom, you can write it in the Q&A box. But please can I ask you to be very brief, and I'll try to squeeze, I won't be able to squeeze many questions in the limited time available, but I'll do my best to take as many as I can. Before I introduce our distinguished panel today, we just wanted to show you a short video to provide a little bit of context for our discussion. So let's watch that video.
Today is World Intellectual Property Day, an opportunity to acknowledge and celebrate the critical role IP has and continues to play in advancing the development of innovative medicines and vaccines.
Reliable IP protections, when used appropriately, enable breakthrough medical innovation, facilitate access to today's medicines and vaccines, and encourage sustainable investment into the cures of tomorrow, so patients living with disease can look forward to a brighter future.
As we develop new science, technologies, medicines, and vaccines, we are simultaneously creating and supporting pro-patient, pro-innovation policies that guide our approach to intellectual property. The ongoing COVID pandemic has exposed many of the inequities that exist across our healthcare landscape, and our commitment to our patients and to bettering society is at the heart of our intellectual property practice.
In order to create innovative drugs, years of strong commitment and significant investment of resources are required. We believe IP protections provide an essential ecosystem that enables us to sustainably achieve the vision of Astellas through not only fostering our own innovation, but also bringing us collaboration opportunities with other stakeholders.
Our Janssen pharmaceutical companies have well over 100 active collaborations with academia, pharmaceutical and biotechnology peers, and public-private partnerships. This level of collaboration simply would not be possible without a reliable intellectual property system.
We are convinced that the responsible use of IP rights promotes the scientific and technological progress for the benefit of patients, their families, and of course society.
In 2021, research-based pharmaceutical companies are announcing 10 IP principles for Advancing Cures and Therapies, or IP PACT for short. The principles in the IP PACT represent a major unified commitment on the part of the research-based pharmaceutical industry, and they place patients at the focal point of our efforts.
We're really excited to be a part of the launch of the IP PACT. This is a commitment on our part and on the part of the whole industry to ensure that the intellectual property protections go to delivering breakthrough products, breakthrough medicines and advances for patients, and that there's a reasonable return expectation.
And the IP PACT is a great example of how we can ensure that information is disseminated towards the patients and the public health system in the best possible way.
So there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. We heard there from leaders in this industry about the importance of a robust IP system. They were talking about enabling breakthrough technology, increasing and enabling access to new medicines, to new treatments, and crucially, securing sustainable investment. We're going to discuss all of that and what role these 10 principles in the IP Pact can play in ensuring this system contributes to that to the maximum with our panel. So let me introduce and welcome them. I'm delighted to welcome Jean-Christophe Tellier, CEO of the global pharmaceutical company UCB. A very warm welcome to you, sir. Thomas Cueni, who is Director General of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations, the Global Association of Research-Based Pharmaceutical Companies and Associations. Also delighted to welcome Paola Barbarino, CEO of Alzheimer's Disease International and a Director of the Non-Communicable Diseases Alliance. And last but not least, Sune Sørensen, Director General of the Danish Patent and Trademark Office. As I said, ladies and gentlemen, completely interactive conversation. I'm going to get us started. Please, if you do have pressing, burning questions, do send them in via the Q&A box. So perhaps, Jean-Christophe, if I could turn to you first. And we heard there from some leaders of industry about how they saw the role of these principles and they saw the role of the IP system. We are delighted to have you with us here today in person. So thank you very much. What do you see as the key challenges that we need to address if we are to be sure that the IP system can play that role? And how do you see the role of these principles?
Well, first of all, Jacki, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a great honor for me to be here with you. And you have seen that in the video, you see the link of IP, and our IP is really critical to sustain innovations. And you know that we are in an industry of innovation. So the importance of a solid IP is very critical for our industry to continue to sustain and to stimulate innovation. I think that one of the challenges that we have is that very often protections, intellectual property and protection for our drugs is perceived as a way to protect interest and not necessarily a way to stimulate innovation. And I think one of the challenges that we have as an industry is to make sure that we continue to clarify the link between innovation and IP and the importance of IP to stimulate innovations and to ensure success for our industry, which means success for society and success for patients to be able to be treated. These principles are very important because for the first time, 26 companies have agreed to align on these key principles and definitions. And you know, we are competitors, so by nature, it's not always natural to define a common theme. But I think it's a very important step forward because it's defined a joint framework, a framework that we all agreed upon and we can refer to in the future. And that gives us transparency, that gives for everyone, every stakeholder also a better predictability.
Thank you very much indeed. And those principles, of course, developed under the auspices of INTERPAT, an association, that group of companies, as you talked about, coming together to promote effective IP protection. Thomas, if I might, from your perspective, the key challenge, one thing there, Jean-Christophe pointing to, is public perception, public awareness. Would you agree that's a major challenge? What do you see as the most important challenges and the role of these principles?
And what's really crucial, Jacki, and JC already explained it, IP is the lifeblood of our industry. Without IP, you wouldn't have the innovative industry, which we all need if we want to have innovative medicines. But I think what goes together, and that's in the perception area, I think IP has to be used responsibly. And I think that's what these principles are about. That's why I'm really pleased that in addition to these 26 companies, which Jean-Christophe Tellier already explained, we already got the full blessing from our IFPMA member companies and associations to embrace the principles. And I think if you bring it down to the gist of it, IP is there to foster research and foster innovation. But IP is not there to hinder research and innovation. And this balancing act in terms of fostering and not hindering is something which is explained and outlined in the principle, I think, in a clearer, more progressive, more forward-looking way than we had in the past. Because this industry, as JC explained, is fiercely competitive. But at the same time, what we also see and have seen more recently is we have more and more collaboration. For example, in the area of Alzheimer's disease, no single company on its own would be able to get the data which you need to identify markers. Therefore, we see more and more collaboration, and I think this collaboration is facilitated by the IP principles.
Thank you, and I'd like to come back to how that works in practice a little bit later on. But Paola, Barbarino, Thomas mentioning there Alzheimer's, and from your perspective and from a patient perspective, how do you see the challenge of ensuring we have this system, that this system is understood, its role is understood? What for you, and how do you see these principles playing into that?
Well, I welcome the principles. Intellectual property is very important. And a lot of people don't understand what it is. Indeed, calling it IP doesn't really help sometimes because people, they know about it in the industry, but other people don't. So if you explain it simply, why would anyone want to put innovation, time, money, effort in inventing something that then is not protected? And I represent 50 million people that at this moment in time live with dementia globally, and many more millions, probably 200-300 million people that are impacted by it as families. There is no current cure. Indeed, we are still looking for a blood biomarker, so there is also no secure way of diagnosing this cheaply. Therefore, all of these people that I represent want to see a breakthrough. They would love to see a breakthrough. But there is an immediate link. If the intellectual property right of those that invest billions behind the research are not guaranteed, what is the incentive for them to do it? Now, yes, there could be other way of doing it, but we are here where we are now, and this is very important. And the 50 million people that have it now need to be assured that somebody is working about it.
Absolutely. And then we'll talk later about how you apply them. The principles, as has already been made clear, really with the patient at their heart. What does that mean in practice? How are they used? But Sune, let me bring you in here. And in terms of your role as a representative of a governmental authority, how do you see the role of IP and the IP system in innovation?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. As has been mentioned by the other participants, we see IP as a key driver for innovation. What we fight to achieve as a public authority is to have a level playing field, to have harmonization across different jurisdictions. In that sense, it will be easier to cooperate across borderlines. And I think another thing which is often forgotten is the social contract, which is built into the IP system, that you obtain an exclusive right for a limited period of time. But in order to have that right, you have to disseminate your technical knowledge so others can invent on top of it. So also in that sense, I think that the IP system has a lot of advantages compared to, for instance, trade secrets.
Thank you very much. And Jean-Christophe, coming back to that point about a societal contract, if you like, in terms of the value to patients of these principles, which would you highlight as being most important from a patient perspective, and why?
Well, I think that I will come to your questions and define maybe one, but I would like to say that all of them are equally important from a patient perspective, because they are designing a framework, a perimeter, which provide the reason why we are here and how we want to operate. And I think that from a societal standpoint, having these principles allow them to better understand the perimeter and to better understand how we can operate. And that's, as I said, that's increase the predictability. Now, if I have to select one, I will probably pick up the first one, because the first one by nature is the one that describes that what we are doing, why we are here, our sense of purpose, if you will, is the benefit for the patients. And so the first principle guide all of us as an industry and each company to make sure that we are leveraged IP, and then we are using these protections to make sure that we are fulfilling our ambitions to define value and to create value for the patient. So I think the first one is the one that I will pick up.
So it's really, what's the end point of all of this? Why do we do it? Who do we do it for? Thomas, accepting that it is they're all important, would you highlight any in particular? Would you agree with that chosen by Jean-Christophe?
Very much so, but basically they are, of course, a whole. And when I look at it, the corollary to IP incentivizing research for the benefit of patients comes, innovation is meaningless if it doesn't reach patients. And I think that's something which you see really enshrined in the principles that we need the IP to invest in research, but we also accept the responsibility that we want to make sure that people have access to our innovation.
Thank you. And Paola, you talked about the importance of a robust IP system. In terms of these principles, where do you see their added value to you, representing, as you said, all those people suffering from dementia, suffering from Alzheimer's, without a cure, but with new and innovative treatments? How do you see, what would you pick out as most important from a patient perspective?
Well, I was excited when Thomas invited me to participate because I think to put the patients and societal benefit at the center of all this principle is important. That has not been stated so clearly before. So that's why I thought the whole of the document was great. But if I have to choose one, I'll choose two. That's Principle 7, where it looks at the possibility of possible exemptions in some cases. Because that is very important. That's always been a gray area, and there are some generic medicines that would benefit from that, especially in lower and middle income countries. And in particular, therefore, I welcome Principle 10 that acknowledges that some of the world's poorest countries just cannot work within an IP framework that is suitable for higher income country. That's very important. And another gray area, the 50 million people I represent are in the vast majority in lower income countries. So this really impacts my audience.
Thank you. We'll come back to that question of exemptions and also tailored use of IP rights a little bit later on. But Sune, from your perspective, you talked about the level playing field and how important that is and how you saw your role there. For you, the importance of these principles for the, as Jean-Christophe said at the beginning, for the people it's for, the patients, to deliver those innovations. How important do you think these principles could be?
Well, first of all, let me applaud the principles. I think they are a first good step in a new direction here. We strive to achieve a level playing field across jurisdiction, as was mentioned earlier. That's a big work being done in WIPO and in other forums. However, I welcome very much to see the industry moving in this direction. But let me say that action speaks louder than words. So I look forward to see them incorporated in the different company strategies, perhaps as you have done with the CSR accounts or with the sustainable development goals. That could be a first step.
So that's very interesting. Yes, we need to embed these in everything else that you're doing. Thomas, I don't know whether you wanted to react to that in terms of how you see these principles fitting into the broader framework of your activities relating to sustainability and so on.
I think very much so. And actually, Paola was talking about, the exemptions. I personally would rather talk about the responsibility for collaboration. And we have seen unprecedented collaboration and partnerships just over the last 15 months in tackling COVID-19. For example, we in March 2020, companies committed to partnerships. They committed even to sharing capacity. And I had quite a few journalists coming to me and saying, they can't be serious. As soon as said, I believe in action rather than just talk. And when you now look at what's happening, for example, in the incredible daunting challenge of scaling up vaccine manufacturing, it's exactly that. It is, on the one hand, partnerships between companies with strong IP who offer their support to others to produce more vaccines. And we also see a tech transfer. For example, when you look at the stats, we have seen 275 contracts just on COVID-19 vaccines. Within the industry, 214 of them include technology transfer, which means when you look at, for example, the current debate on IP waiver, and we may get into that, access to the IP information, which, as the CEO of Moderna said last Friday at the media briefing we gave, it would give you the paper for the patent and what's written in there, but you wouldn't get a single dose more. But whereas if you do tech transfer, you do engage in joint training of scientists and engineers, you do transmit know-how, and you also do want to make sure that the recipient of your tech transfer is really fit for purpose, can live up to the quality assurance you want, whether it's for an Alzheimer medicine or for COVID-19 vaccine. That's what I would call walk the talk.
Thank you. And I'd like to come back on that question of access to patent information a little bit later on. But Jean-Christophe, coming back to this issue of collaboration, we heard in the video about one of our speakers in the video said we simply couldn't have this level of collaboration without an effective, robust IP system. It wouldn't be possible. Why do you believe, and as Thomas was just saying, we've seen such remarkable collaboration between in an industry that is fiercely competitive during COVID. Why do you think, just to explain to the layperson, why are IP principles important to foster partnerships and collaboration?
Well, maybe the easiest way to think about that is to connect IP with value. In a sense, an IP is there to protect the value you are creating. And you have creating this value because you have invested, as you said, billions into translating science into a medicine, into certain processes. As soon as you feel that you are protected, and then you can start to share, then you can start to collaborate, then you are not afraid, you are not scared to go with others and to build with others something else, and having tech transfer, as Thomas said. So because you feel protected of the value that you have been able to create, then you can collaborate. And collaboration is important because of the scaling effect. You have seen that in the COVID, you will see that in dementia. I'm sure that the collaboration will help to make sure that we accelerate and find faster an ability to discover innovation. And that's also the second element of collaborations and of this principle, if you will. It's the ability to define where you are protected, and so you can engage into a partnership with rules that is very well known by everyone. And then you can also define more clearly what is outside of this IP, and so where you need to collaborate even before any type of protection. And for public-private partnership, for example, it's very important. And in Europe here, this ability to engage with the commissions on certain projects before, where everything can be protected, is also a way to accelerate later on the ability to translate this science into potential medicine. We need to better understand the science in order to then extract from that new hypotheses that will lead to innovation in the future.
And Sune, you talked about the level playing field, and Jean-Christophe talking about that, really having the confidence, people having the confidence to collaborate because the legal framework is clear, there is a certainty in it. How important do you believe they are, and in order to see the sorts of collaborations we've seen over the past 12 months, remarkable degree of collaboration?
Well, first of all, I totally agree on what was said just before about how the IP system encourages collaboration. I mean, you are not afraid of getting copied from other companies. If you have IP protection, then you can move into new markets, and you can have private-public partnerships as well. I think it's extremely important that we have a level playing field in as many jurisdictions as possible, and that is what we strive to achieve. I know it's a big problem, not only for big companies, but especially for smaller companies. In Denmark, which is a small open economy, we have 99% SMEs, and for them it's a big challenge to move abroad if you have different rules and different jurisdictions. So that's why we strive to achieve a harmonized IP system.
And also helping those small companies to take up their rights, to use their rights, because some don't know how to or what to do. Paola, from your perspective, and in terms of collaborating with patients, working with patients, this principle number 3 in our list of 10, very much emphasizing this here, and the partnership. How do you see that the effective collaboration with organizations like yours to make sure that you really are, as has been said in the principles and in this discussion, at the heart of everything that is done and at the heart of the approach to IP?
Well, our organization, and many have mentioned the dementia space in this conversation, very much supports Principle 7 of the Global Dementia Action Plan of the World Health Organization, which is emphasizing the importance of data sharing. Now, I see this importance of data sharing, and Thomas knows this because we've talked about it in the past, as a wider issue. I think data sharing has to happen at industry level, governmental level, and we've been talking about smaller entrepreneurship. That is important too. And a robust IP framework is absolutely necessary. Academia also is very interested in the protection of its intellectual property rights. Everybody is. Again, we are not going to create new value for the patients, in my case, new disease-modifying therapies, unless we make sure that those that are putting the investment in it see some level of protection of their thinking. And that is absolutely essential. I know that you want to talk also about patients' data.
Absolutely.
And that is also very important, but we'll tackle that later.
Come back on that point in a little while. But Jean-Christophe, coming to Thomas talked about the accessibility of, we'll talk about patient data later, but of patent information. And Sune talked at the beginning about the importance of being able to build on what has already been done to develop other innovations and so on. And principle number 5 commits the industry to support voluntary and meaningful initiatives in this area. Why do you think this is important, and how do you see this being applied in practice?
Well, I think it's a very significant element in the future. I think if we want to be more meaningful and if we want to be more focused on the outcome and on the results, we need to more than ever build what we are thinking and building our hypotheses on data. And the data are today too much fragmented, and the data are not communicating to each other. I think that from a technology standpoint, the solutions are here. And in the future, we will be able to make sure that the data coming from different sources are able to connect to each other in order to better understand the reality of the outcome. And I think we need to move into that more and more, into gathering this data. That's the reason why the protection and IP is also important, and we need to be clearer into defining what we can share and what we can protect in order, once again, to stimulate a transparent collaboration where people are not shy or scared to share things, but on the contrary, wants to contribute. Because for the future, what is very important is understanding the real impact on what we are doing, but not just the medication. The overall strategy of how to treat a patient required a lot of connectivities between all of the different stakeholders that contributes to treating the disease.
And Sune, from your perspective, from an IP authority perspective, this question of patent information and accessibility of that to, as you say, build on the innovations that we already have, how do you see that, and how do you see that translating in practice?
Well, obviously, I see it as extremely important. That's a way to gain even more innovation in a society. So when you disseminate the technical details of your patents, which you are obliged to do in order to gain a patent, then you allow others to invent on top of it. So I think that's something you should work on a global level to make it even more accessible, to open up databases. And that's something we are working on also as a public authority.
Is much work you're working on as a public authority, is much work being done at European, at international level on this at the moment?
Well, we have been striving to attain this in WIPO for decades. It's not the fastest moving world, the IP world, but it moves in the right direction slowly at a steady pace. We do the same in the EPO, the European Patent Office, but also in other forums we try to achieve harmonization. We have the B+ group with some of the industrialized countries. So there are many different forums where we strive to achieve this.
And Thomas, and by the way, ladies and gentlemen, don't hesitate, get those questions coming in if you have any questions for our panel. Thomas, this importance of doing this, as Sune said, not just at the national level or even the European level, but at the international level. But Sune saying there, this is a world that doesn't move very fast. How can we accelerate progress, and how important is it to have this global approach?
I think basically by moving, Sune initially talked about the social contract, which means by the very definition of a patent, all the information is out there in the internet. It's available. You can find it in the patent offices. But I've said in the past that basically you need a PhD from the MIT to find it. And that's why I think an initiative which I helped to implement, PACT Informed, is quite an important game changer. When I came to Geneva back in 2017, the industry had been discussing about the joint initiative to put this information easily accessible into the public domain. And we then made it happen within a matter of 3 months. I can tell you it was pretty controversial within the industry because some companies were afraid that this would, make it easier to criticize them, to have litigation, whatever. Nothing like that. It made it easier for procurement agencies to get the information they want. For example, to find out whether a medicine important for poor countries is still patent protected in that geographic area or not. And we have by and large seen that even some of our fiercest critics have applauded the initiative. Of course, they want us to go further. But in my view, and that's important for the whole of the principles are not the end of the way. They are not the destination. They're the start of a journey. And that's what I see with PACT Informed 2, where we started with the small molecules, with the essential medicines list. And I have no doubt that we will move beyond that to make it easier to access this information.
Thank you. And Paola, you talked earlier about access to patient data. And this, of course, a crucial issue for patients and crucial to their confidence in the whole system. How do you see the challenge ahead in this area if we are to ensure this collaboration, these partnerships that you've all emphasized are so very important, but also maintain patient trust in that process?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's a very important issue right now. But it's very interesting that it can be solved. So last week I was chairing a webinar where 2 luminaries from Korea were explaining to us how they are currently treating their patients' information. Now, it's interesting how their database was created. So there are about 800,000 people with dementia in Korea. About 400,000 of them are formally registered. Now, the fact that this exists, leave aside how it actually was created, is extremely important because people can access services. So this is the first thing. There was an important report by OECD in 2018 that just showed, especially at European level, how much lack of information there was, how we are lacking registries of people living with dementia. So registry is a complex word. It can mean a lot of things, but at its most basic level, I think if you don't know who has a disease, then obviously you are not putting the finger on the pulse of where the problem is and not giving people access to potential clinical trials, to possible breakthroughs. So there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done. Now, Sune was rightly pointing out, this is an area, the IP right, that moves very slowly. I have to say, at the level of registries, this moves even more slowly, and there is a lot of diffidence, and we've seen it now also during the COVID-19 pandemic. There is a lot of skepticism. There is an important point that has to be made in terms of educating people around the fact that their data, yes, is very private and can be kept private, but there is an element that we are not just going to get the breakthroughs we need if we don't know who in our population has a particular issue.
And that brings us back to some communication issues, which I'd like to touch on before we end. But Thomas, if I could come to a principle we haven't mentioned yet, and it's been raised by the audience. There is a principle relating to generic and biosimilar medicines, and we've had a question from the audience. How relevant are these principles to generic companies? Can you pick up on that?
I think they're really very important because when you look at social contract means you publish so that others can work. but in return you get a limited period of exclusivity. Now, I think we have had issues in the past where some people try to extend this limited period of exclusivity. And I think there we are interested in get a rapid clearance, in accelerating processes of litigation, which means these principles are about what IP principles stand for, what it should be good, but also it should define the red lines in terms of what's not so good, although they're framed in a positive way. What the industry has really moved a long way, and JC also mentioned it, is the collaboration and the understanding that even the borderline between competitive and pre-competitive has moved. There's now much more open innovation, pre-competitive. And what we see more and more is that IP does not mean you have a monopoly. IP does mean that you can have, for example, 10 plus COVID-19 vaccines, and you do have a very healthy competition because of IP.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to come in on that point? Jean-Christophe, did you want to react on that?
No, I agree. I think it's very important to continue to leverage the fact that IP is a fair incentive to innovate. And so it's important to justify, in a sense, or incentivize companies to invest into research and ensure that in the end, the patients can get the benefit out of that. But for the cycle to work, we also realize and recognize that at the end of the patent life, it is fair then to share it for the benefit of other companies and for the broader benefit of the world. So the investment that have been put into these products can be reallocated to other innovation. And this is also how the system works, and it works pretty well because it has been able in the past to make this cycle and refresh, in a sense, the value of innovations into newer compounds and not focus too much or too long reimbursements into compounds which have been then be open to society. To give you an example, nobody challenged already statin, hypertension in cardiovascular prevention. All of this is now free of charge. It has been free of charge almost for decades or for years now. And so when we look at the value that the industry brings, we look at this patent protecting period, but the value remains for a much longer period of time.
Thank you. Sune, as an IP authority, did you want to comment on this issue of generics before we move on?
I think it's been very well put forward.
Fine. Thank you. I did want to come back on another point because Paola talked at the beginning. She made reference to Principle 10 relating to developing countries and different socio-economic circumstances. There's also Principle 9, which talks about a tailored use of IP rights to facilitate partnerships to advance public health where in specific circumstances this adds value for patients. And you talked, Thomas, about the impact of COVID and what we've seen in COVID. And of course, the work on producing these principles began before the pandemic. But nevertheless, both generally and in the context of the pandemic, how do you see this tailored use being applied? How might it work in practice?
I think there are two different elements. As all of you know, the TRIPS, Trade-Related Intellectual Property Agreement, does include exemptions, including for emergency situations. You do have the flexibility. But having said that, what we saw now in COVID is that actually IP worked at its best as an enabler. We wouldn't have the fast reaction with 200 plus projects on vaccines, with equivalent amount or even more on treatments, if we wouldn't have started on the basis of strong innovation ecosystem. I think what comes with that, and we see it now played out, if people are willing to listen, is that the IP exemption, for example, compulsory license or waiver, wouldn't really give you the solution to expand access to scale up, because the solution requires more than the patent. It does require voluntary licensing. It does require tech transfer. And I have to admit, I wouldn't have been sure 15 months ago that this would work out as it did. But now I'm truly proud how our industry has responded. For example, when you look at the number of voluntary licenses a company such as Gilead has signed up to, joint efforts between Eli Lilly and BMGF on monoclonal antibodies scaling up, and those are just two examples, but even bigger in the vaccines field. And we just had a joint media briefing with colleagues from developing country vaccine manufacturers. And they, for example, one company such as Barbarino said, we own 150 patents. We are fully committed to doing tech transfer, but every company which wants to do tech transfer with us needs to meet the checklist of 50 points, in particular on quality, and if they can't meet it, they are not good enough. We really see the best of the IP system now working out, and I think that's what's really meant. And I'm sure this will evolve further, but it is something which, in particular also in the context of future pandemic preparedness, I think we as an industry need to be willing to sit down and engage in dialogue.
Thank you. And Paola, you raised this issue right at the beginning in your first answer to me. How do you believe this principle needs to be applied in practice? Because as Thomas said, having the principles is one thing, it's how you apply them. How do you see the challenge to make sure that this is applied in practice?
Well, this is a really complicated issue, and as Thomas said, it depends also on other things. I'm going to go a little bit off track here and quote another example. When I joined ADI in 2017, shortly afterwards, a very big company pulled out of research on dementia and Alzheimer's, which is one of my biggest nightmares. You know, if companies do not research this area, that means that, you know, a whole series of things may not happen in the future. In this particular case, the company had been involved for several decades in neurological research and Alzheimer's in particular. And I was very concerned about what would happen to their intellectual property rights, what would happen to their research, what would happen to their databases. And that really prompted me to research a little bit more in depth. What could happen is that, you know, decades of research could just go completely unheeded and disappear, and nobody could have access to it. And most recently, we've seen with another company that has done a lot of wonderful research on Alzheimer's, that when they revisited some of their data, they came to the conclusion that actually a previous failure may in fact be a success. That's not been confirmed yet, but it tells you how important it is to troll the archives. You know, data and science in this disease takes years to actually get anywhere. And this information is gold dust, the work that people have poured on. So I welcome these IP principles because they may coalesce the industry into thinking, what do we do when something fails? How do we make sure that the data is not lost, that somebody else can access it, protecting the original creator to a point? And then at some point, as Jean-Christophe was saying, things have to become free for everybody. It happens also in literature, as you know, I'm sure, you know, after 70 years, manuscripts become public property. And it's also important to make sure that happens.
Thank you very much. Jean-Christophe, please do react to that if you want to, but there's a specific question to you from our audience, and it relates to publicly funded research and development. And the questioner asks, what is your approach to public funding for research and development and its relationship with the IP rights then claimed by the private sector and accessibility for their products? Can you pick up on that point? Because it is an issue that comes up very often.
Yeah, no, I understand the point. It's a very fair question. So my experience on that relates to the collaborations within IMI, which was the public-private partnership, as you know, between the European, the Commission, the European Union, and the pharmaceutical industry. What I have learned by working in these projects was two things. The first element was it's important to collaborate, and collaborations create even more hypotheses and even more projects we can work upon. And there are a lot of fields and a lot of areas where today the pharma industry by itself will not be able to invest sufficiently because these areas are either too early or too complex or too broad. We need to focus much more. And this is a field where I do feel public-private partnerships are very important in fundamental science, in area where it's not directly connected to a specific disease immediately, but who needs to be developed in order to create a platform that can generate new hypotheses in the future. If there are no public-private partnership in this area, if there are no collaborations between academic university and pharmaceutical industry individually or collectively, it's unlikely or less likely that we'll be able to, later on in 10 years, 15 years, we'll be able to have new medicines. So this is an area, for example, where public-private partnership is really critical.
And Thomas, please do comment on that if you would like to. But also another question that's come in. Could you clarify how IP contributes to ensuring access and affordability? The audience questioner says it might be stimulating innovation, but does IP really contribute to what's important to patients? And this links to a broader communication issue, which I'd then like to come back to with Paola and Sune in a minute. But what is your reaction both on this question of public funding and the relationship with IP and on what it gives the patient and getting that message across?
I think basically there are two different issues. What we have seen, and Jean-Christophe already explained it, there are areas where public-private partnerships are crucially important. And we have seen also the evolving, relationship from basic research to applied research to pandemic preparedness. And in particular during this pandemic, it's overlooked. When you look into the amount of public money going into scaling up of vaccine and the risk investment in vaccines, it was significantly higher, the share, than in treatments. In the treatment area, when I looked into what's happening in terms of opening your libraries, looking at what you have in compounds, by and large, companies took the risk. And by and large, when you look at it, not many companies succeeded in terms of bringing repurposed treatments successfully against COVID-19. And the money they invested was at risk from their side. Also, what's quite often overlooked is that by and large, pharma companies haven't really benefited in terms of their share price market cap from COVID-19. The exceptions are a couple of biotech companies. They had nothing before. Now I think they deserve to get the benefit, and maybe one other vaccine company, but that's about how far it goes. But it comes, in my view, access IP is innovation is meaningless if it doesn't reach the patient. If you would have asked me or the industry 20 years ago, I think the industry didn't really feel that societal expectation, societal responsibility to do its own part. Whereas now, when you talk about, IP should come with the commitment to access, I think companies are really serious. At the same time, I think we also need to be honest in expectation management. Without progress in universal health coverage, even the 20 cents per day for your antihypertensive treatment or 10 cents per day may be too much for somebody living in poverty. The same would go for a new dementia drug or when you look at insulin.
Thank you very much. And Sune, please do react to that. I saw you scribbling away, so you may want to comment on that. But I also wanted, in the time we have left before we try and draw some conclusions, to come back to this issue that we began with, really, which is public perception of the role of IP and whether it fosters innovation or hampers innovation. It's not well understood. That's one of the reasons companies came together to develop these principles, because they felt there were misconceptions around it, and this would help clarify those points. Who needs to do what, if you like, to get that message across about the benefits of IP that we've been talking about? And do you do this collaboratively? Do you see this as a role for everybody who's a part of this discussion, and more broadly? How do we address this issue? Same question to you, Paola, and then I'll come back also to Jean-Christophe and to Thomas.
Well, I think it's important to raise awareness about the benefits of IP. We try to do that as a public authority working together with the industry. especially together with SMEs, having role models telling how they had a good experience using IPs to protect a new innovation, how that could help them attract investors, how it made it easier for them to collaborate with other companies. So we, in general, I think as a public authority, we have a responsibility to raise awareness about the benefits of IP as a key driver of innovation. A lot of the big companies are very well aware of how to use the IP system, but a lot of the smaller companies do not know how it functions.
So both to the general public, to patients, and to small companies, you think you have a crucial role to play. Paola, for you, in terms of how we communicate these benefits, you as a patient group are already doing this. And is it just a communication question, or is it also, we have a question from the audience about, do we need to reform the IP framework to improve it for patients? Is it okay as it is and we just need to make it more understandable to the public, or do we need changes as part of all of this? And then I'd like to come to the role of industry in this communication effort with Thomas and Jean-Christophe. But Paola first, please.
Thank you. As Thomas was speaking earlier about the previous question, which also is tied into this question, something came to my mind, which is the case of one of the medications which are outside IP rights in the case of dementia. This medication has been around for a long time and is now a generic medication. And even that is not on the essential medicines list of the WHO. Even that cannot be accessed by patients in many countries around the world. So that tells you that the problem is bigger than just IP rights. You know, IP rights are here to protect innovation. So it's an interesting point for me, that issue. I can see it going forward, as another speaker say, as an important thing. If we don't do it now, in 20 years, we won't have certain results. So that's the spirit in which I am taking this. And then we, as a patient organization, have a huge amount of work to do still to make sure the patient gets access even to things that were invented 20 years ago that they still don't get access to. And so from the point of view of communication, our job is to make our audience understand why it is so important for us to support industry to continue to innovate. But believe you me, my audience understands that full well, because they're all hoping for, you know, a breakthrough any minute now.
But so perhaps in an area like yours, because of that desperate need for a breakthrough, they understand it better than in some other areas. So in terms, Thomas, of working on this collaboratively, and in terms of who needs to do what to get this message out, it's a difficult one for industry, isn't it? Because people will say, well, industry, you would say that, wouldn't you? So do you think, how do you see your role, and the same question to you and Jean-Christophe, in terms of getting the message out, given that coming from you, it might be viewed with more suspicion than coming from Sune or from Paola? Do you see an issue there?
Now, if I may start, Jacki, I always say I was born an optimist, and even now in older age, I still am an optimist. Therefore, and I've become more optimistic over the last 15 months. When you look at how the industry responded and how fast it responded to the pandemic in a socially responsible way, with all due respect, and I hope, Sune, you will not mind me as a government representative saying that, I mean, we did rather better than most governments when you look at the masks, the PPEs, or the intensive care unit beds missing. And I think we have seen the strength of the industry at its best. Having said that, I do believe that we need to continuously engage and look at how can we do better. For example, why is it that we didn't have the structure in place for the pandemic in terms of public-private partnerships? I've seen really the strengths of organizations created over the last 20 years, like the Global Fund, like Gavi, and like CEPI. All of them used to work with the private sector. And we need to be willing to sit down and talk about business not as usual in times when it's needed, in order to have people accept that actually the best incentive to invest somewhere is the IP and the market reward. And we see the problems where this is missing, antimicrobial resistance. You can't make any money with novel antibiotic research. That's why we really need to be more creative.
Thank you. Jean-Christophe, a question to this communication issue, and then I'd like to, before we close, just try and identify the way forward. But Jean-Christophe, on communication.
Well, maybe two things on my side to close on this part. The first one is we need concrete example. And I think building on what Thomas just said, I think the last 15, 18 months with the management by the industry, the collaborations about the way we have been helpful on COVID-19 is a wonderful example of what can be done together. And you can feel that IP is here an enabler and not a blocker. So we need much more example. We need this example to be shared and to be better known, because otherwise it's a battle of words, it's a battle of communication. But I think people may see and need to see that the value of collaborations and IP, what can be done concretely. So one element is concrete example and experiences and building these experiences. The second element is this collaborative approach and the ability to build things together. As long as we are perceived as one stakeholder against another one is right, one is wrong, I think that it's difficult to build a common future. I think it's much more important to recognize the contribution that each of us we have in this value chain, and making sure that we are much more able to work together to put the real topic on the table and understand what are the real bottlenecks, to avoid that some simplification sometimes highlighted one element which actually doesn't make any sense.
Thank you very much. We are almost out of time, and I just want to try, it's been said a number of times, this is a journey. Sometimes a slower journey, sometimes a faster journey, but a journey. So on that journey, and I'd like to come to Paola first on this last question, because the patient is at the heart of all of this. So let's start with the patient. For you, Paola, going back to the title of our session today, if we want to ensure that our IP system really does work, does operate in a way that consistently has patient and societal benefit at its core, what for you is the top priority now or the key next step?
To me, is to make sure that this is not rhetoric. You know, to have patients and society at its core, it means that every time decisions around IP are taken in industry, the people responsible, ultimately, is always people behind this decision. Remember that it is a patient and society that should be at the core of taking those decisions, and no other important consideration. I'm not saying they aren't, but they wouldn't put society and patient at their core. So it's just a reminder that that is what it means.
Thank you very much. And from your perspective, Sune, key priority, key next step?
Well, as I said earlier, action speaks louder than words. So I like to see them incorporated in the different company strategies. I think it's a good first step. There are some good principles. Paola mentioned principle 7 about the Ebola exemption. So you can have faster generics after your limited time of exclusivity. So I think it's a good first step, and I welcome the next steps coming from the industry.
Thank you so much. Jean-Christophe.
Well, I think everything has been said. It's alignment, right? What I would like to see is an alignment between what companies will do and respectfully align with these principles, and then everybody can see that these principles serve as a real guidelines to make progress, and that the decisions of the company are illustrated by this principle, and rally more companies, because we need to continue to rally even more companies. So creating really a momentum where it could be a new alphabet for all of us in this area.
Thank you very much. Thomas, you have the last word.
I think basically it is about willingness to further evolve and work on principles, sit down with Sune and Paola and others and talk about where can we make more progress. I think in principle, social contract, we do deliver on innovation. I think there is margin for improvement to walk the talk on access, where we also need this balance and where we also need the social contract.
And on that note, it only remains for me to thank you so much, all of you, for taking part in our discussion today. And thank you to our audience. We managed to squeeze in a lot of your questions. There were a couple more we didn't have time for. But thank you. We've covered an enormous amount of ground, and we've begun to chart a way forward because, as you say, today the launch of those principles, but it's a journey that begins here. So thank you again to our panel very much for a great discussion. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. And it only remains for me to wish you a pleasant rest of the day and stay safe. Thank you all very much and goodbye.
The IP PACT is a groundbreaking, unified statement from innovative biopharmaceutical companies that sets forth the principles outlining our approach to intellectual property, with patient benefit as our North Star. It's important to us that patients and society understand the way we use IP, and why it matters for our efforts to advance medical progress and patient health. IP is a fundamental enabler of great scientific advances and breakthrough medical innovation. It facilitates access to the medicines and vaccines of today and enables the development of tomorrow's cures to help people live longer and healthier lives. IP is a cornerstone of a thriving research ecosystem and lays the groundwork to find solutions to combat pressing and future medical needs, as witnessed during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are committed to using IP as the critical tool that it was designed to be, to enable the innovative advances that extend and improve patients' lives. IP rights are a proven way to create dialogue and foster global partnerships and collaboration with different stakeholders. This facilitates and advances progress towards our shared goal of overcoming global health challenges worldwide. The key principles that we launch today reflect our joint commitment to continue to use IP as a means to advance the goals of improving and extending patients' lives. We stand behind them as we push ahead to develop the therapies, vaccines and cures of tomorrow, keeping patients' needs at the heart of everything we do.